Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Radium and today I have another episode of my Terraria Calamity mod progression guide for all of you. Now this episode we're going to be covering hard mode, which means after defeating the Wall of Flesh, all the way up to the Moon Lord. I'm going to be giving tips and tricks and basic progression throughout this video, just to help you guys on your way really. So with that said, let's get into it. Using the Pwn Hammer you got from your Wall of Flesh fight, you can consider breaking the Crimson or Demon altars in your world. These are a vanilla thing, where you can add in certain hard mode ores into your world, which have different properties. And some of them are really good, which will definitely be very helpful for your first boss. And mining them will also help you start the roll of progression, so you'll be able to start progressing through the game and making more upgrades. Whilst traversing your world, you might notice there is a brand new biome, known as the Astral Biome. This is an incredibly interesting place with some very useful stuff. This is a little bit later in terms of the gear here. Like, you'll be using this stuff a lot later, but it's incredibly useful to know the location of. And there are some basic items you can get by mining this monolith and killing a couple of the larger enemies the second you enter hard mode. This is something less significant, but the sunken sea biome underneath the underground desert gets updated the second you enter hard mode. And the enemies like the giant clam get buffed, so yeah, they have a bunch of new drops in their pool as well. So I'd heavily recommend checking this out if you're playing hard mode Calamity for the first time. After you've been mining for some time in hard mode, you're going to want to craft yourself a decent set of armor. I'd heavily recommend going for at least Mithril, as this is a very decent set to start off with, and obviously enough go for the corresponding helmet. But if you're ready for putting in a bit more of a grind, then feel free to go for any of the higher tiers such as Orichalcum, Adamantite and Titanium. And some of the more class specific armors such as the Spider Armor and the Forbidden Armor, just depending on how much effort you're willing to put in. The next thing you'll want to do after that step is finding a viable weapon for the next boss you're going to be fighting, which is most likely Cryogen, as he's the first one in terms of standardized progression. Just in case you guys don't fully understand, these are some good weapon recommendations for the first fight. And all of these, even if they're not the most effective, they'll definitely get you through that battle. The last mandatory upgrade you're going to want to make is obviously enough wings. The ones I'd recommend out of all of them would definitely be Frozen and Harpy wings. Although Frozen is the best, there are definitely some advantages from taking Harpy, and feel free to look into it depending on your class style. The boss spawner for Cryogen is called the Cryo Key. It's crafted from 5 Essence of Helium, which you find from underground enemies in the snow biome, 3 Souls of Light and Night, and 50 Ice Blocks, so a very simplistic crafting recipe. And once you use the item, the boss will spawn. It's a relatively simplistic fight, a barrage of different projectiles, but nothing too severe. And any relatively experienced Terraria players shouldn't have too much of a hard time learning this fight. After the boss has been defeated, you'll get access to a brand new NPC, the Cryogen Lore, and in all honesty not too much else, but you additionally get the unlock of an amazing armor set, known as the Daedalus Armor, because the ice caves are crackling, which means you can mine cryonic ore, and that spawns in the underground caverns, just in the ice biome. With the resources you get from Cryogen and the Cryonic Ore underground, you can craft the Daedalus Armor, which I'd heavily recommend getting. It's one of my favourite sets up until maybe Calamitous, and it provides a wide variety of options for all classes. I'm personally going to be using melee for a bunch of this demonstration, but any of them are viable, and will really benefit your weapons. At this stage, I'd recommend you try fighting one of the mech bosses. This may sound crazy to some of you, but I think the mech bosses are a brilliant boss to fight at this stage, after Cryogen is defeated, as it'll give you really good upgrades to fight both the Brimstone Elemental, the Aquatic Scourge, and the other mechanical bosses you'll need to face later on, as hallowed bars are significantly more valuable in Calamity. But if you don't want to do this boss, then feel free to take another order. After you're done with the mechanical bosses, you may want to consider exploring the Brimstone Crag a little bit more, which is an area of the game with unique enemies now which can drop Essence of Chaos. And there is a brand new boss down here which I'd heavily recommend fighting, the Brimstone Elemental. It sure is a difficult fight in my eyes, but one that if you can best will definitely give you some incredible loot drops for this stage in the game. And I'd just heavily recommend getting used to this, as this is the kind of fight that Calamity consists of for the most part. After the Brimstone Elemental is defeated, you can mine Shardor, which in my opinion is not as special as Cryonic is. And Cryonic is so good for most classes that you will not need an upgrade for an incredibly long time. The final alternate boss to do, rather than the mechanicals, is the Aquatic Scourge. This is a boss you need to use seafood to spawn, or just wait long enough for him to spawn naturally. And it's spawned with 10 sulphurous sand, 5 starfishes, and 3 shark fins. which is incredibly easy to get. This is an incredibly fun fight I enjoy doing a lot, but the boss can be a little bit troublesome sometimes. However, this boss is extremely susceptible to piercing weapons and weapons of that caliber, so you don't necessarily need incredibly strong items, just weapons along that kind of bracket. After you defeat the Aquatic Scourge, a post-Aquatic Scourge Acid Rain will spawn. With enemies of increased power and damage, they will be incredibly difficult to kill, but there are some new weapons for you to obtain from this event, so if you're a rogue in particular, I'd heavily recommend investing some time in this event, as there are some great weapons for all classes, but mainly rogue in my opinion. At this stage, you'll want to finish the 2 other mechanical bosses off. You should be more than capable of doing so, but in case you're struggling, feel free to take some more accessories, such as Avenger emblems, grinding for an Ankh shield, or just reforging your items and preparing buffs properly. All those minor changes will slowly add up and make you significantly more powerful. After all 6 of the first bosses are done, you're going to want to consider crafting an Eye of Desolation. There's a debate on whether you should fight Calamitous or Plantera first, but in my opinion you should always do Calamitous, as it provides some really good items. It's crafted with 10 Hellstone bars, 7 Essences of Chaos, and 3 Blighted Lenses. And this boss is incredibly difficult for new players. If you want a tip, use the Abaddon, which is an item you get from the Brimstone Elemental, and it makes you immune to the debuff he gives you. This is a fight that's going to take a couple of tries for sure, but once you get into a groove, this is a fight that will give you some brilliant rewards, and it's really fun as well. After the Mechanicals, Calamitous, and every other boss is defeated, you're going to want to consider looking for the Plantera Bulb, and additionally mining some Chlorophyte. You can easily bait this ore out using Spelunker Potions, and in my opinion, even if you're not crafting the Chlorophyte armor, it's worth getting a bunch of it, because there are various other options you can get after Plantera is defeated, such as the Spectre armor, the Turtle armor, which you can get beforehand in all honesty, and additionally the Shroomite armor. I just want to additionally mention that the Plantera Bulb is craftable in Calamity. It requires 15 Jungle Spores, both of 10 souls of Night and Light, Murky Paste, Man-Eater Bulb, and a Trapper Bulb, which you get from the respective jungle enemies. After you've defeated Plantera, you can do this actually before the fight of Plantera, but a new unknown entity will spawn at World's Edge right next to your regular ocean biome, not the Sulphurous Sea. This enemy will turn into a boss once it is killed, or like its first phase is lowered. It'll become Annalisa, I believe that. No, Anahisa, however you pronounce that. But it's an incredibly difficult fight with a bunch of varied projectiles, and it additionally summons a Leviathan friend once it gets to a certain point in health. This is an incredibly fun battle, and I won't spoil it for you, as this is just a progression guide, but it's a fight I'd heavily recommend checking out, as it's just so fun. Before we get into the next boss, I just want to recommend 2 accessories in particular for this fight. You can actually do this fight before Plantera, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's before Golem, but these are the 2 accessories I'd recommend using for it. First of all, the Angel Treads, as they significantly increase your running speed and acceleration. So, heavily recommend these. And then the Master Ninja Gear is next, as both of them are just incredible for this fight. The boss in particular we're fighting is Astrum Aureus. He's a very interesting looking boss, and give me a moment to set up a potential arena for him. To summon Astrum Aureus, what you're going to want to obtain is the Astral Chunk, which is crafted with 15 Stardust, which is dropped from pretty much every single enemy in this biome, and 10 Fallen Stars, which are very easy to obtain. It's also important to note this boss can only be spawned at night, so I'd heavily recommend getting yourself a Cosmolite at this point, which is an incredibly simple item to craft. You're going to need a Daylight, which is crafted with Souls of Light and Hellstone bars, if I remember correctly. And then you're going to want the Moonlight, which is crafted with Frigid bars, which drop from Cryogen, not Cryonic. And then Souls of Night, which are fairly easy to obtain. Once you obtain this thing, you'll be able to adjust day and night very easily, and this is the boss you'll be fighting. I'd recommend getting an upgrade to your weapon above the Shadow Flame Knife at this point, but these are the bare minimum in terms of the recommended weapons. Once the boss is defeated, he'll drop you an adrenaline boosting item, which is really nice, as well as a bunch of incredibly cool weapons. But he additionally unlocks a brand new chest in the dungeon, which is the Astral Chest, and it contains a pretty good weapon for rogues if I am correct. I'm not going to show all of this, but this is pretty much the brink of the game before you fight Golem. If you want to do anything such as the Pumpkin and Frost Moon, the Solar Eclipse, and any other mini bosses like the Great Sand Shark in the Desert Biome, I'd heavily recommend checking them out and doing them now, as this is pretty much the final stage. Their weapons and items will remain pretty useful. I'm sure if you're playing Calamity, most of you have seen the dungeon at this stage, but this is an area you'll have to traverse to fight Golem beforehand, and the best way of disarming it is just taking down the pressure plates before the fight starts, maybe preparing a single row of platforms as well if you're feeling vigorous. But this is a relatively easy fight when compared with most battles in Calamity. So the fight plays out exactly the same as you'd think, apart from with a very, very insignificant twist. Golem is incredibly simple, and as I said before, you're going to want to build an arena for him. But it's also just an incredibly enjoyable fight, and one that can kind of take the heat off, because Anahita and the Leviathan, as well as Astrum Aureus, are both incredibly difficult fights that will for sure have challenged you newer players at this stage. After Golem is defeated, you'll get a guaranteed Pixar in Calamity, as well as a bunch of Beetle Husks, Essences of Sunlight, and a Shiny Stone. These items can be crafted for some relatively useful items in Calamity, so I'd recommend holding on to them for sure. At this stage of the game, one thing I'd recommend doing is the Martian Madness event, as you will need the incredibly powerful weapons for the upcoming fights. There are 3 fights before you get into the Lunar events, which I will cover shortly, but I'd recommend going what isn't the commercial order about the bosses, as the fights are so incredibly difficult for new players. So the first one I'd recommend doing is Duke Fishron. I'm sure most of you have experienced a Duke Fishron fight before. It's a vanilla boss you can fight regardless of whether you're playing Calamity or not. And a weapon I'd recommend for this fight for sure would be the Influx Waver from the Martian Madness if you're playing melee. But just be creative with it and use some of the items you've gotten from other bosses if you want. This is once again more of a personal preference thing, but I'd recommend farming out Duke Fishron until you get both the weapon that you want for your class and the Fishron wings. The Fishron wings are absolutely incredible. And in my opinion, the wings you're gonna maybe consider using for both, well, all of the next bosses, but especially the Moonlord, as the frozen wings or any wings up until this stage are gonna feel pretty sluggish. The next fight up your guys' alley is going to be a horrible one. It is the Ravager. It's summoned using the Death Whistle, which is an item crafted from 5 Solar Tablet Fragments and 10 Lizard Bricks, which makes this a post-Golem item. So this, as you can probably guess, is going to be incredibly difficult. The boss is like an advanced version of Golem, with incredible power, and once again the Terrorblade is not a good weapon to use for this fight. I'd heavily recommend using much stronger items than this. But the fight is incredibly fun if it compensates for anything. It's one I'd heavily recommend creating a long platform for and just running, whilst the onslaught of randomized projectiles come at you. And I will not be explaining how to do the fight, as this is a progression guide rather than a boss guide. But there are many a guide on YouTube for you guys to check out if you are struggling. After you defeat the Ravager, he drops a wide variety of items as well as a rage boosting item, such as the Realm Ravager, which is a really good ranged weapon, and there's so many more. The Ultimus Cleaver in particular is very nice. But overall, I'd recommend checking this boss out a couple times, as it just has some incredibly useful items. And it actually provides you Cryonic, Perennial, and Scoria bars, which is a material I forgot to mention earlier on. I kind of messed up mindly in terms of explaining the ores, but I'll just do it now because it shouldn't make too much of a difference. After you defeat Plantera, Perennial ore is blessed within your world and you can mine it. It's an incredibly simplistic looking ore, as you just saw, and it's used to craft Reaver tier weapons and a bunch of random looking weapons, which are very good. And after you defeat Golem and obtain yourself the Pixar, you can go into the Abyss and mine Scoria. Now the Abyss is the underwater biome from last time, but now you can do a lot more in this biome, as there are a bunch of weapons, the hydrothermic armor, and a bunch of really cool upgrades for you to get, as well as putting it towards some of the most valuable resources in all of Calamity, life alloys. After you defeat Golem in your world, the jungle becomes plagued, which means there are various new enemies, and every enemy has the chance to drop these things called Plague Cell Canisters. These are used to craft the Abomination, as well as a bunch of other cool weapons. And it summons the Plaguebringer Goliath. This is the crafting recipe, very simple apart from the Plague Cell Canisters, which you now understand how to get. And using this item will summon the Plaguebringer Goliath, which is an incredibly cool fight that you should not do on the surface as he gets enraged. So you're going to want to build an underground arena for sure, and since I'm using God mode I won't die. But this is a very difficult fight I'd recommend heavily preparing for. At this stage, you're pretty much ready to progress to the lunar events. This is when you fight the lunatic cultist, and this is going to be an incredibly difficult fight for players, I think. Because if you're playing with Vengeance or Death Mode, it adds a bunch of random twists to the fight that makes it a lot more challenging than you're used to. This fight is normally a cakewalk, but you will genuinely need to spend some time planning in order to beat it this time. And in my opinion, using weapons without homing but with fast fire rates and good accuracy are the way to go about this battle. After you defeat this boss, a bunch of content is unlocked, and heck, I got the Thorn Blossom, which is an incredibly rare weapon. But the Ancient Manipulator is very important as it's used for crafting a bunch of really cool items. The two items I think you should consider making right away are first of all the Heart of the Elements. This is a combination of items throughout most of hard mode, as well as the Aero Stone, which you get from the Desert Scourge. And all of these weapons are relatively tedious to get, all of them have a low drop chance, and some come from bosses, others come from mini-bosses. But the item gives so many good stat increases, it's one I'd heavily recommend for any player. It also summons these elemental waifus as they're known, which are incredibly powerful. And luckily for you, that's only the first accessory I'd recommend. The next one is called the Absorber. This is an incredibly defensive accessory, so if you're going for a glass cannon-esque loadout, I would not recommend it. Maybe use something like the Void of Calamity or Extinction instead. But it gives you so many good mobility and defense boosts that I'd heavily recommend getting it for most players, especially new Calamity players. I lost a tiny bit of footage, but you want to consider maybe trying to fight one of the pillars. The enemies don't just drop their respective fragments in Calamity, they also drop this material called Meld, which is used to craft a wide variety of incredibly useful weapons by crafting Meld Construct, which is incredibly cheap to make. It's just a combination of Meld and Stardust. And it's used to make various weapons for, I'm pretty sure, every single class. However, that's not the most important thing right now. You can summon a boss before the Moonlord at the Astral Biome, known as Astrum Deus. You need to use the Titan Hearts, which you get from certain enemies in this biome. They're incredibly simple to kill and very big and small, but what you want to do is, at night time, you want to activate the Astral Beacon, which is a giant tower in your Astral Biome, and it will summon Astrum Deus. He's a giant worm, and this fight is incredibly fun. Unlike a lot of bosses, Astrum Deus actually has a bunch of really cool items, such as the Starfall, which is a really good weapon, and just so many cool little things to use. And I'd heavily recommend checking these out for all classes. The final benefit of defeating Astrum Deus is being able to mine the Astral Meteor. I don't have a good enough pickaxe, I don't think. Or maybe it's just bugged. I think the pick sort is good enough normally. But you're supposed to be able to mine the Astralore. And it's used to craft a bunch of really, really powerful weapons. And in my experience, good enough to take care of the Moonlord. In all honesty, the Moonlord is not too tricky of a boss, but you're gonna want to make sure you have a suitable loadout for it. So definitely be using solar or like fragment tier weapons at a minimum. And you're gonna want a significantly stronger character than me. I forgot to upgrade my character, but all the accessories I've showed you will really help you on your journey. And it'll help you defeat this final hurdle until we progress to the final third of the game. With the Moonlord defeated, you're pretty much done with hard mode. There's not too much to do, and I'm going to cover everything else in the final episode. And I feel like that's going to be a very interesting weapon to make. You'll see how much stuff we just unlocked. With that said though, I just have to say thank you all so much for watching this guide. I really hope it helped some of you. And if it did, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support really keeps the channel going. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out, guys.